Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Mr. David Vine about U.S. bases and military operations around the world. Mr. Vine is an associate professor of anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C., and is a regular contributor to TomDispatch.com. He's the author of Base Nation, How U.S. Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World, and his work has been featured in the New York Times, The Washington Post, The Guardian, and numerous other publications. You can follow his work at basenation.us and at davidvine.net. For more information, see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/bases. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you.
So let's start off by just explaining the origins of U.S. bases abroad. Why do we even have bases abroad? How did we start doing this, and when did we start doing this?
It's a great and important question, and that's, in a way, the question motivating much of my book. I didn't think much about U.S. bases overseas, like I think most people in the United States, until I was actually introduced to the story of Diego Garcia, base in the middle of the Indian Ocean, where to create the base, the U.S. and British governments exiled an entire people. And when I heard about that story almost 15 years ago, it opened my eyes not just to what had happened to the people, the Chagosians, but also to this huge network of bases, and led me to ask questions like, why do we have a base in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and why do we have hundreds, at that point, more than 1,000 bases overseas? Now there are about 800 U.S. bases outside the 50 states and D.C. But the history of it, for the most part, dates to World War II. That's when the United States built a network of bases outside U.S. territory larger than any collection of foreign bases that any people or empire or nation in history had ever possessed. Although it's important to point out that the U.S. has had extraterritorial bases dating basically to independence. The Army forts outside the 13 original states, of course, were incredibly important in conquering native peoples and dispossessing them and displacing them from their lands as the United States expanded westward to the Pacific. But by the end of the 19th century, there were a handful of bases outside North America. But the real expansion came actually before the United States entered World War II with the Destroyers for Bases deal, where FDR signed a deal to exchange World War I era destroyers with Great Britain for 99-year leases on bases in British colonies. And then once the United States entered the war, the military's approach was basically to build as many bases as possible in as many places as possible as quickly as possible. And there were thousands by the end of the war. And once the war ended, many of them closed, but there was a very large and significant infrastructure of bases that remained. And basically that remained in place throughout the Cold War. And once the Cold War ended, there was again a reduction of about 60% of the overseas bases. At that point, there were 1,600 or so. But again, this very large, what I call a base nation, remained in place despite the disappearance of the Soviet Union. And that collection of bases has remained in place to this day.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think we've kept so many bases open?
I think it's a complicated question, and I think there are a number of different dynamics. There are economic dynamics, political dynamics, some bureaucratic dynamics, and ideological ones. To start with the last, I think, and again, this is part of what motivated my book, Base Nation. There's been an ingrained and entrenched assumption that the United States must have hundreds of foreign bases and hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops on foreign soil to protect national security. And that's been the unquestioned assumption since the earliest days of the Cold War. And I think effectively this is an outdated foreign policy strategy that really needs questioning. And the book tries to show that in a variety of ways, these bases are in fact not protecting national security and are actually undermining national security in a number of ways. But in terms of the economics, these bases cost tens of billions of dollars a year. By my estimate, around $150 billion a year it costs us to maintain bases and troops outside the United States. So that money's going somewhere. A lot of it goes to pay salaries of military personnel, but military contractors make billions on building and maintaining these bases, and of course have a vested interest in seeing this system perpetuated. And other corporate interests, of course, benefit, or at least perceive benefit, from having U.S. bases in other countries. Politically and diplomatically speaking, these bases have provided a source of pressure and leverage on the countries that host them. In some ways, I describe them as being like a Trojan horse, where often the United States has been invited into countries. In other cases, these are bases that were established as part of the occupation of Germany, Italy, Japan, and then remained in place. But once bases are established, they become very difficult to uproot and become a source of power for U.S. negotiators in a range of negotiations, often having nothing to do with matters strictly military. So in essence, I think U.S. bases overseas have been often overlooked major source of power for the United States in the post-World War II era. A major part of the United States' status as a superpower that's maintained other countries in subordinate status, and an umbrella that of course has been in some cases to the mutual benefit of foreign governments and the U.S. government. But I think all too often these bases have not benefited either local populations or people in the United States.
So how many bases, how many countries does the U.S. military have these bases in today? And what do these bases look like compared to the sorts of bases that the U.S. military has within the United States?
So today there are about 800 bases, and this comes from a Pentagon figure. They put together a list every year, and their last count, the number was about 700. But the Pentagon's list excludes many well-known bases outside the United States, including those in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. So by my best estimate, after now almost 15 years of research, there are about 800 today in about 80 countries. And we can compare that to the end of the Cold War, when there were about 1,600 bases in 40 countries. So we've seen a decline in the total number of bases, although it's important to point out that at the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were more than 1,000 bases in those two countries combined. But at this point, we see a decline compared to the end of the Cold War in the total number of bases, but spread. The breadth of the base network has grown quite dramatically. The total number of countries hosting U.S. bases has about doubled. And your other question, what do they look like? Many of them look like bases in the United States. At least some of the largest bases in Germany and Japan, Italy, and elsewhere, South Korea in particular. You can be on base and think that you're somewhere in the middle of the United States. These are small American towns. Effectively, they have schools, hospitals, fast food, recreational facilities, housing, family members, and are quite explicitly and intentionally designed to look like the United States and designed to make military personnel and their families feel at home. In other cases, the bases are quite a bit smaller and wouldn't look as like most bases you'd find in the United States. At the other end of the spectrum, there are what are now called lily pad bases, or cooperative security locations is the more formal term. And these have grown increasingly popular in recent years and typically host a few hundred members of the military and don't host family members and don't have many of the amenities that you see at the larger bases, the little Americas, as they're often referred to. And you see a wide range of bases in between. But one of the central questions I sort of pose and encourage readers to ask is how would we feel if there was a foreign base on our soil? How would we feel if we were living next to foreign troops and foreign military weaponry? I think it's frankly, quite difficult for people in the United States to contemplate even a single base on our soil or a single base anywhere near the United States, the U.S. borders, belonging to a foreign power like China or Russia, or even, a close ally like Britain or France.
So the premise of your book is how U.S. military bases abroad harm America. So can you give us just an example or two, or why do you think military bases abroad can hurt?
Sure. To begin with, they're the costs. As I said before, they're, by my estimate, and I dove into Pentagon budget documents to try to figure out what do these bases actually cost us. And as of fiscal year 2014, by my estimate, $150 billion we're spending to maintain bases and troops overseas. And of course, that money could go to many other pressing needs here in the United States, domestic needs. It could also go to better position our military to protect U.S. borders and to protect the United States. Again, to go back to your question of why these bases have remained so long, part of it is simple inertia in many cases, that once a base is established, it becomes, for a variety of reasons, very difficult to shut down, even if there's no particular strategic reason to maintain the base. Sometimes the military just likes having a base overseas. It's the case of the headquarters for the Africa Command, for example, which is in Germany. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, has shown that maintaining the headquarters for the Africa Command in the United States would save millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars every year. And be beneficial in other ways as well. But the military just said, based on military judgment, they want to keep it in Germany. This doesn't make any sense, and there are plenty of other examples. We can, but beyond the economic costs, there are also ways in which bases overseas are directly counterproductive to protecting national security. Bases in the Middle East in particular play a role quite like drone killings do, or Guantanamo Bay, which is back in the news, in that they provide a recruiting tool for Al-Qaeda and other militant groups. That is, that there's research that shows that the presence of bases and troops in the Middle East has actually increased Al-Qaeda recruitment and led to more people who would wish to take up arms and harm Americans. And we need only think about Osama bin Laden's professed motivation for the 9/11 attacks. He, clearly cited the presence of U.S. bases and troops in the Muslim Holy Land as his justification for attacking the United States. And then I think we also have to think about the effects on local populations. And I show how bases cause environmental damage. Sadly, some members of the military commit crimes when they're overseas. It's a small minority, but whenever it happens, it not surprisingly outrages locals. There are a number of ways in which bases actually prop up dictatorial regimes. There's a clear preference that the military has shown to maintaining bases in undemocratic countries, often quite repressive, violent countries, Bahrain being a prominent example, Saudi Arabia. And in this way, we see U.S. bases actually halting the spread of democracy and again, propping up and undergirding the status quo in undemocratic countries. which I think should be incredibly troubling to us. Often the justification for the bases, going back to the Cold War, has been that these bases spread democracy, but the exact opposite too often appears to be the case. And these are just a few of the harms that I think go along with this huge network of bases.
Well, and this network of bases has helped to enable a lot of the wars across the Middle East and elsewhere, and interventions by the U.S. military, right? Can you go into how this network of bases has helped allow for that?
Absolutely. That is another central concern of mine, that, again, one of the justifications for the bases for decades has been that these are bases that keep the peace and are defensive in nature. But the track record, again, clearly shows that these bases have made war easier to wage overseas, far from the United States. It's made it easier to wage interventionist wars of choice, like the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that have gone so disastrously wrong. And disastrously is a vast understatement, given the chaos and death and destruction we see in the Middle East today. Having so many bases has just made war a far too easy foreign policy option for U.S. leaders and for, of course, pundits and others who would encourage U.S. leaders to go to war. And so we see that these bases, quite to the contrary, quite in contrast to the claims that they're defensive in nature and deter foreign enemies, they have been typically quite offensive in nature. And Diego Garcia is a prime example, the base I mentioned before in the middle of the Indian Ocean, where an entire people was displaced to create the base. And displacement is another pattern we see in terms of how bases harm foreign populations. But Diego Garcia has made it easier to wage the wars and two wars in Iraq, the first and second Gulf Wars, and base again played a key role in the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. Base thousands of miles from U.S. borders. It's, in my mind, a very difficult argument to sustain that Diego Garcia protects the United States, protects U.S. citizens in any substantial or significant way.
What is some of the competition that exists from other countries involving where to have foreign bases? I believe that there's some contention with China over bases in the Pacific.
Well, for the most part, at this point, there's no competition for specific base sites. That was a dynamic in the Cold War, where there was jockeying between the Soviet Union and the United States for access to base sites in other countries. Right now, the only case we might see vaguely resembling that is Djibouti. Although, so what we see in Djibouti is the United States establishes base there in 2002, not long after invading Afghanistan, and the base has grown quite substantially. It's one of now a growing number of bases in Africa, where there, to that point, been very little U.S. presence. There had been a longer-standing French base in Djibouti, and recently there's been news that China signed an agreement with the government of Djibouti to establish its own base there, which also there's also a Japanese base, its first overseas base since World War II. But this is not, as far as anyone can tell, a matter of competition. Djibouti has just become the leading country in the world to host foreign nations' militaries on its own soil. But in East Asia, what we're seeing is, there's been talk of this Pacific pivot, Obama's Pacific pivot, to check the rise of China and the rise of its military power. And its military has grown in strength clearly over the past several years, and its military spending has grown as well. But the idea that the United States needed to shift more military power into East Asia is perplexing. There were already literally hundreds of U.S. bases in East Asia, in Japan, Guam, South Korea, among others. And in my mind, increasing the size of the U.S. military presence in the region only encourages China to build up its military presence and military power further. I think we, again, could think about how U.S. government officials, U.S. military leaders, the U.S. public would respond if China were to build even a single base anywhere near U.S. borders, in the Caribbean, for example, or in Mexico. I think there'd very quickly be a hue and cry to build up U.S. military forces and U.S. military power, and to respond. And meanwhile, we're encircling China and Russia, for that matter, as well, with bases and troops.
So you mentioned Djibouti in there, and I want to go back to that topic and the topic of Africa in general. Why has the military insisted that it only has one base in Africa, and it's that base in Djibouti? And just how widespread are U.S. military operations and bases in Africa?
Yeah, it's often there are linguistic games played played by the Pentagon officials in terms of the language around what is a base, what's not a base. They claim that there's been a temporary base in Honduras for now more than 30 years. It dates to 1982. How that's temporary is beyond me. And often they actually also say it's not a U.S. base, it's a Honduran base, and they're simply guests on this Honduran base. If you go there, as I did, the Honduran military is a small Air Force academy. They barely have any planes. And the U.S. base vastly, dwarfs the Honduran military presence there, not surprisingly, given the state of the two countries' militaries and economies, for that matter. But in Africa, indeed, the military has said for years we only have one base, but they've actually started just in the past few months to acknowledge that there are other U.S. bases or cooperative security locations, as I mentioned before. So by the best count I've seen, it's Nick Turse has done terrific reporting on the buildup of the U.S. military in Africa. He's found that there are now more than 60 U.S. bases, access points, and other facilities in Africa. Djibouti, again, is the largest, but there are now facilities of various kinds, bases in places including Cameroon, Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Kenya, the Central African Republic, and the list goes on.
What do you think the reason is for the buildup in Africa? What do you think would be the strategic reason for that?
Well, I think if you asked members of the military and others who might support this buildup, they would say that the strategic reason is they would say a number of things, including, that these forces are necessary to improve the status of African militaries, to combat militants in Africa. And I think, if you look at the track record of the Africa Command, which now controls U.S. military forces on the continent, it's been pretty appalling. Some of the militaries that they've trained have gone on to overthrow democratically elected governments. The humanitarian operations that the Africa Command frequently trumpets as their main it's the main work that they're engaged in Africa, which of course is false and just sort of PR. But the actual projects that they've carried out, humanitarian that is, have proven by the Pentagon Inspector General's own investigation to be very poorly run and counterproductive in some cases. So those would be some of the strategic reasons, but I think, often it's not really strategy that's driving the buildup or presence of U.S. bases. It's sometimes, frankly, again, just bureaucratic interest. The military is looking for things to do in a post-Cold War era, and specifically the military in Europe, which I think we need to ask, why does the U.S. military in Europe at all? NATO allies have very powerful militaries on their own, and in the absence of the Soviet Union, what is the U.S. military doing in Europe, which has no real enemies? People who would say that Russia poses a grave threat to Western Europe, it's just a gross exaggeration. Russia pales in comparison to the power of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So in this post-Cold War era, the military in Europe has been looking for things to do, and moving into Africa was one of the things that it did, and that led to the creation of the Africa Command. And they've basically looked for ways and opportunities to increase their presence. The Ebola buildup, which we could talk about in more detail, but the Ebola buildup gave the military another reason to build up forces and facilities, including a base in Senegal, and basically many of the troops were brought home, but it was a way in which the military expanded its presence, and often these are now small bases. You could say, aren't these preferable to the little Americas, the huge bases in places like Germany and Italy and South Korea and Japan? They aren't. Bases once established, again, tend to stay in place, and these small bases are specifically designed for rapid expansion. So a small base can quite quickly become a much larger base. Where with costs running into the tens of millions, hundreds of millions. And Diego Garcia is actually another example. It was built as what military told Congress would be an austere communications facility. Meanwhile, they had already had expansion plans and were starting to ask for more money. And the base is now a multi-billion-dollar base. So this is, again, one of my concerns about the buildup in Africa is that, some might say it's quite modest, but meanwhile it could and has already shown that it's expanded over the last decade or so. The other dynamic, I think, clearly has to be that of China. China has increased its presence on the continent, but until it signed this agreement in Djibouti, the Chinese presence is entirely, as far as I've seen, been commercial in nature. China has invested in a variety of ways, and obviously in very self-interested ways in terms of extracting resources and making investments and winning friends with the help of investments. And meanwhile, I think the U.S. strategy to asserting its influence has been through military power, building up military ties, which there are military interests there, but part of the aim is also to build stronger government-to-government ties and to keep African countries within a U.S. umbrella. U.S. umbrella or alliance of some kind.
So before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you talked about briefly a little bit earlier, and you touched on this with Bahrain and Saudi Arabia in particular, but that's how these bases and military operations provide legitimacy for different repressive and authoritarian regimes around the world. So can you talk a little bit more about that and maybe give a few more examples of how and where that's playing out?
Sure. This is, again, a long-standing pattern that dates to the Cold War. During the Cold War, there were U.S. bases in Spain, which had been a ally of Nazi Germany, and was still run by General Francisco Franco, his dictatorial regime. South Korea was also for long stretches during the Cold War not a democracy, run instead by strong-armed dictators. And again, in the post, and I think it's important to point out that during the Cold War, some justified that by saying, "Oh, well, basically that the fight against communism trumped any concerns about human rights, and we have to have bases in these countries for that reason." since the end of the Cold War, very few people have questioned why we have bases in places like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. The United States has bases in all the countries of the Persian Gulf except Yemen and Iran, and all of those countries are undemocratic. Most of the countries in which the U.S. is building up a presence in Africa are undemocratic to one degree or another. Singapore, another example of an undemocratic regime. The U.S. has a significant base there. And Honduras would be another case where, the U.S. At very least did not object to a military coup in 2009. And there we see a government with very questionable legitimacy. Certainly the immediate government after the coup was an undemocratic and military-backed government. But you can see that across the globe there are examples. And as you said, these bases provide legitimacy. And, if you were a pro-democracy activist in one of these countries, what message does it send when you see the U.S. government dealing with an undemocratic regime that you're trying to change? Whose side are we on? All too often, the U.S. military and the U.S. government and the United States as a whole has been on the wrong side. And again, as you said, supporting and providing legitimacy to repressive regimes.
Okay, David. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Well, thank you. It's really been a pleasure, and I really appreciate the questions and your interest.
Well, thank you for joining us, and we'll definitely try to have you back on to talk about the Diego Garcia tragedy in more detail.
Oh, that'd be fabulous.
And where can our listeners go if they want to find more of your stuff?
Sure. They can check out basenation.us. That's basenation, one word, .us. It's a website, not just for the book, but it's a place to learn more about U.S. bases overseas. You can also check out there are 16 terrific maps that depict this global collection of bases in a variety of ways, and they are all available on basenation.us. There are also articles and other resources available. And then davidvine.net. It's davidvine.net is another place to find some of my writing and articles. So I encourage folks to check it out.
Well, excellent. I just want to remind everybody to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/bases. We'll link to everything there. And thank you once again for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.